I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish.
When President Kennedy laid down this challenge, the Soviet Union already had secret plans to land a man on the moon. They spent billions of rubles on the race. Yet for over 2 decades, they pretended their program did not exist. It is the biggest cover-up in the history of space travel. If the Soviet lunar program had been successful, this man might have taken the first step on the moon. Alexei Leonov was one of 3 cosmonauts selected to pilot the Soviet lunar landing craft. There were a total of 9 cosmonauts in the program. Some, like Leonov, were training to land on the moon. Others were preparing to fly round it. They were not allowed to discuss these plans outside their closed circle. Until recently, it has remained a forbidden subject.
So, could you tell us what the lunar lander looked like, please?
Today, for the first time, General Leonov agreed to describe his secret mission.
Much better to make a scheme instead of many words.
Is it similar to the American lander?
Like American, because the spacecraft which are going to land into the moon, this spacecraft must have all necessary equipment for that. And the antenna, main antenna. In Russian versions, we have only one man which landed to the moon. And the step, лестница. This is a position cosmonaut. He can see through this window and select place for landing on the moon. He had about 25 seconds for selecting.
In 1959, the Soviet Union established an early lead in the race by launching several unmanned rockets towards the moon. They successfully crash-landed an object on its surface and then flew another probe behind the moon. It sent back pictures of the far side, which had never been seen before. In 1963, Khrushchev was basking in the reflected glory of the cosmonauts. Their space flights had been a great political triumph. The Soviet Union had just scored a double first, with the first woman as well as the first man in space. And Khrushchev wanted more. The American astronauts put on a brave face, but they had taken second place every time. They never knew what to expect next. Whenever NASA thought they were narrowing the gap, the Soviets would strike again. The early single-seat spaceships had served their purpose. Both sides had orbited the Earth, and both were now gearing up for the next round with bigger capsules and rockets on the drawing board. Korolev, the chief designer behind the Soviet space program, was developing his strategy to put a man on the moon. A new giant rocket would have to be built, big enough to carry a lander and command module to the moon. Korolev would have to fight great battles over the design of this rocket and what fuel it should use. Once in lunar orbit, it was planned that a cosmonaut would make a spacewalk from the command module to the lander, which was folded up inside the lower stage. Blasting the lander free, this cosmonaut would begin his descent to the moon, while his partner remained in orbit. The Soviets knew it would be safer to land 2 men, as the Americans were planning to do. But the Soviet rocket would not be able to carry the extra weight. After a few hours on the surface, the cosmonaut would return to the command module for the journey back to Earth. But the moon landing was years away, and the chief designer faced a more immediate challenge. He knew that NASA had plans to launch a 2-seat spacecraft called Gemini, which would allow astronauts to rendezvous in orbit and perform spacewalks. Korolev had a 3-man spaceship on the drawing board. This craft, called Soyuz, was a brilliantly adaptable design which could be used for the moon missions and link-ups in space. But it would not be ready in time to be Gemini. To satisfy Khrushchev's demands, Korolev hatched a desperate plan: to convert the old single-seat Vostok craft, which had taken Gagarin and the other cosmonauts to space, into a 3-seater. Many of the engineers rebelled because safety would have to be sacrificed in order to stay ahead of the Americans. Konstantin Feoktistov, one of Korolev's most talented designers, was at the center of this protest. He was also an outspoken critic of the moon program. Korolev's devious plan to rid himself of a troublemaker was a masterstroke. He knew that Feoktistov wanted to travel to space himself.
К вопросу о том, чтобы посмотреть, нельзя ли на Востоке послать 2-3 человек, он возвращался несколько раз. И каждый раз мы доказывали, что это невозможно, что это опасно, что вот лучше потерпеть и подождать, когда мы сделаем корабль «Союз», который предназначен для того, чтобы летать 2-3 человека, и в котором будет хорошая система аварийного спасения. Но он все-таки нас добил. В феврале 1964 года он решил зайти с тыла. Он сказал, что ежели мы сумеем разработать корабль на базе Востока 3-местный, то уж, по крайней мере, 1 место будет отдано инженеру. Ну, такая постановка вопроса показалась уже очень соблазнительной. Буквально через несколько дней мы тут же уже ему предложили первые наброски и предложения. Он принял это дело. Мы выпустили где-то в конце марта уже, в начале апреля, основные исходные данные по этому кораблю, который потом стал называться «Восходом».
To adapt the old Vostok, the ejection seat and control systems had to be removed. 3 seats were then installed. It would be too cramped for spacesuits. Tracksuits would have to do. In an emergency, escape would be impossible.
А с точки зрения безопасности, там эти вопросы были, прямо скажем, игнорированы.
А почему так получилось?
Если бы я знал.
То есть вы считаете, что полет был небезопасен?
Далеко не безопасен.
Even though he knew the risks better than anyone else, Feoktistov donned his flying helmet to become the first engineer to go to space. On October the 12th, 1964, the intrepid three-man crew squeezed into the pod and were ready for blastoff.
Потому что ракета, на которой мы летели, мощность ее струи — это примерно 10 миллионов лошадиных сил. Вот в душе каждого человека есть наездник известного рода. А тут оседлать сразу 10 миллионов лошадей, табуну 10 миллионов лошадей — это очень впечатляет, не говоря о том, что это физически